Good evening, and welcome once again to the Bible Speaks, or perhaps I should say welcome once again to the new Bible Speaks, because as you can see from behind me here, we are moving gradually into the digital age. When I first started doing this program some years ago, we had a couple of very old Panasonic cameras, and we didn't even have a bookcase in those days, and we didn't have that wonderful mural that you've seen behind me from time to time, and we kind of plodded on for a few years like that. Then we get the bookcase, and then we get the other studio with the mural, and we switched backwards and forwards. So for a couple of years, well, more than a couple of years, we really thought we were special because we had that. And but things change. We're converting, as I told you before, we are gradually converting the whole system to HD. The two or three cameras that we're using now are, I wouldn't say top of the line, because they will be the studio cameras you see in TV studios, but they're certainly very high-end portable cameras and HD. And we're having to rewire the church, not an easy job in a 100-year-old building, to replace the standard definition cables with high definition cables. And of course, as all things in most churches, it's being done by volunteer work, because to get a quote technical crew in here to do it would cost more than, well, let's face it, I wouldn't go to the church with that sort of budget anyway. So due to some very talented people, and that's the crew in here, new ones and old ones, what we have is we're gradually going into the digital age. What you see behind me is, in fact, and I suppose you all know what this is, it's on a green screen. If I turn around and look, I don't see that wonderful picture of the church. What I see is a big green cloth, and there's a couple of umbrellas with lights on them, and cables all over the floor, and nothing that you were going to see, of course, but I see it. And right in front of me are a couple of cameras and a worried-looking camera person. And this is the first time that we've done this. So, first of all, bear with us. We will probably have the odd glitch from time to time. My hair will probably disappear, go green or blue or whatever the current value is. And we're learning. But rather than just sit around until we're picture perfect, we're going to learn as we go, as we've always done. In fact, it's a good metaphor for Christian faith as it is, because we are always learning, and we're always learning on the go. I don't think there's anybody who says, I've got it all hacked, I know it, I've got the Bible down memorized, I know all the commentaries, I've got it made. Because every time you do that, you find something else that you didn't know, hadn't understood, somebody reveals it to you. When I write the notes, I mean, I always call this a script on my tablet here, but in fact, if you look at it, it won't make sense to you, because there's a lot of disjointed comments, which are basically the highlights of what I want to talk about, and I try and talk around them, which drives the chaps in the control room mad, because under this new system they have we're going to be having some photographs, some pictures coming up on screen, and later on perhaps some videos. I don't know if we got too many Bible videos. I want to fit in with the program, but as you can see, we're taking giant steps, but doing them quite slowly. And I think the good Lord has been very good to us in providing the funds and everything to get this far, and of course getting me to dress properly, because now I have to wear a jacket here in the studio. Thank goodness for air conditioning, because if I have a shirt that's all one color, it does something technical over there. I can't wear green at all. And any big mass of colour throws the techie boys into a fit. Obviously, our equipment is not as up to date, perhaps, as that of a TV studio, and that's another thing we're going to have to look at. But anyway, we try very hard. Okay, we're going to Stored Cities of the Bible, and we've done several of them up to now, and you've been watching the program. Tonight we're going to talk for a little while about Bethel. Now, Bethel is mentioned many times in the Christian Bible and in the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament. and it's got a lot of history to it, a great deal of history. So to start off tonight, we'll go into a bit of that. First of all, they're going to show you a picture in a moment of what Bethel is today. Okay, there it is. If you go to Bethel today, or where it's supposed to be, that is what you will see. Basically a mound of rubble on top of a mountain. Okay, unfortunately, Bethel has disappeared off the maps, unlike Jerusalem and Shechem and some of the other towns we've talked about, which the remains or even modern towns sit on the site. Bethel is no longer there. So let's go back and start looking at it in a bit of a history. And I'm having to work very hard at this because I don't know when they're going to switch. Okay, Bethel in the old Canaanite language, which is Ugaritic, which you don't need to know or worry about, but anyway, it's the old Canaanite language. Bethel, which is basically BT and then IL. Bethel means the house of El. El, if you remember from some of my previous broadcasts, El was the name of the god. The word Baal comes from there, and some of the others, but the original deity that they worshipped, the Canaanites, was a gentleman called El. In fact, you've heard me say this many times, but if you read Robert Michener's book, The Source, which is totally fictional, but it has a great description, the man did his homework, on where El sat in the life of the early Stone Age, which is where we were at. Okay, so it also, in Hebrew, it means house of God, or Beit El. Now, Beit, B-E-I-T, is the Hebrew word for house, and the Arabic word as well. Beit means house. So Beit El means the house of El. Okay, so even the Hebrews, but El also could be pronounced as God, translated as God. So Beit El. Okay, in the Greek and the Latin, it's Bethel. They just run the word together and make just one word of it. And in the Hebrew Bible, which is our Old Testament, it's described as a border city located between Benjamin and Ephraim, the other tribe, two tribes, Benjamin. And there'll be a map coming up in a second. It's also, there we go, there's also it's a location named by Jacob. So right back in the beginning of Israelite history, there it goes. Okay, you can see on the map where it is. I'm told that if I point to it, I'll get the wrong hand, because what I'm seeing on the screen in front of me, the monitor screen, is the reverse of what's actually being shown behind me, which brings me to remark on how clever our weather people are on TV, because they're doing the same sort of thing as I'm doing here, and it's backwards. So you've got to point with the wrong hand. For example, I think I'm pointing over there. You see what I'm doing? I'm pointing the wrong way. So it makes for an interesting program for everybody, and you too, I hope. Okay, so it was between Ephraim and Benjamin. Okay, some historians, not all, but some historians have identified where it was as near the village of Beit-In, B-E-I-T-I-N, which is in the West Bank of which you saw on the map, but in the West Bank of Israel, and they identify it with ancient Bethel. And really, what they base this assessment on is the location, which was described in the Hebrew Bible. In other words, okay, we know Benjamin was there, we know Ephraim was here, so it's got to be here, and this name is very similar. You know, the physiological similarities between the modern and the ancient names. I mean, the replacement of the Hebrew El with the Arabic In is not unusual. It happens all over Israel. As we go into these cities and villages, you will see that. And during the Israelite rule, okay, the 12 tribe rules, Bethel first belonged to the tribe of Benjamin, okay, but it was later conquered by the tribe of Ephraim, which totally surprised me, because I didn't think until the split came with Israel and Judah, I didn't think that they did raiding on each other, the Israeli tribes. I didn't think they did that, but apparently it was later conquered by the tribe of Ephraim. Benjamin, of course, being one of the very small tribes and really part of Judah, really kind of an offshoot of Judah. Now, Eusebius of Caesarea, who's an ancient historian, okay, and Jerome, who is if you've done any ancient history at all, Jerome is a chap who really nailed it as far as ancient history goes. They describe it in their time, which is the Roman times, okay, as a small village that lay 12 Roman miles, okay, north of Jerusalem, to the right, or the east, if you will, of the road leading to Neapolis. Now, we heard that before, haven't we? Neapolis, modern-day Nablus. Okay, so all of these cities in the Bible all tie into each other if you stay with it long enough. Okay, and if they show the map again, you will see where Neapolis is in comparison to Bethel and that sort of thing. All right, if they show the map, of course, whether they're going to show it or not. Anyway, 10 years after the Six-Day War. Now we're jumping right ahead now. We're jumping right ahead. 10 days after the Six-Day War, the biblical name was applied to, there's the map, you can see where Nablus is. We're still learning, we're getting there. Okay, but anyway, as I say, 10 days after the Six-Day War, between Israel and Egypt and that sort of thing, the biblical name was applied to an Israeli settlement called Bethel, which was constructed adjacent to where they think it was. I mean, but, if it's 12 miles north of Jerusalem, near Nablus, okay, that's where we'll have it. Bethel's mentioned several times in Genesis. It's first mentioned in Genesis 12:13. Now, the reason I say mentioned in Genesis, why I'm making it important, is because whatever you believe about Genesis, whether it was, an eyewitness account or whether it was written centuries later by the Jews as they were trying to put their history and their faith on paper, it's mentioned as a place where Abraham stayed and built an altar on his way to Egypt. Now, you remember Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldees, which is way, way south, and came all the way up, and eventually went to Egypt, and on his return. So he stopped there on the way up and on the way back. Okay? And it's said to be close to Hai, which is Ai, that's the name of the town, or just to the west of it. So what the Israelis did, the modern Israelis did, was pinpoint where the town would be and kind of said, okay, well, we're going to build a settlement there and we're going to name it after the ancient town of Bethel. But I remind you that there's very little archaeology done there and very little evidence of where it was at all. Okay? The most famous part of Bethel, or where it's really well known, is in Genesis 28. Now, the gentlemen in the control room are looking frantically now for the picture I want to show, but it's in Genesis 28 when Jacob was fleeing from his brother, okay, Esau. Remember, Esau was out to kill him, and he gets tired and falls asleep on a stone and dreams of a ladder, there it is, stretching between heaven and earth and thronged with angels. Okay? God stands at the top of the ladder, according to Genesis, and promises Jacob the land of Canaan. Never mind that there's a whole bunch of Perizzites, Hittites, Canaanites, a whole other bunch of tribes living there. God promises Jacob the land of Canaan. Okay? So when Jacob wakes up, okay, after the dream, Jacob wakes up, he anoints the stone he was lying against. He anoints the stone with oil and names the place Bethel, house of God. Okay? For Genesis 35 kind of repeats this covenant with God, and the naming of the place is El Bethel. So, a slight variation. And incidentally, that place marks the site where Jacob changes his name, or Jacob's name is changed from Jacob to Israel. People miss that sometimes when they're reading through. They don't catch that change, okay? But both versions, both verses in Genesis state that the original name of the place was called Luz, L-U-Z, Luz, which is a Canaanite name, not surprisingly, since it was the land of the Canaanites he was in. Bethel's mentioned again in the book of Joshua, to be precise, as in Joshua 7 and Joshua 8, as being close to Ai again, and on the west side of it. And the reason that it's mentioned is that Joshua sends men from Jericho to capture Ai. The Israelis have conquered Jericho, and we've discussed that in a previous program. Whether the walls fell down or not is immaterial. The Israelis were there, and they went after Ai. And in Joshua 16, it is said to be next to Luz. In other words, Bethel is next to Luz, which was the old Canaanite name. So there's some pretty definitive evidence, both secular and biblical, that this place was there, close to where, in fact, they say it was. Okay? And again, it's said to be near Jericho, and it's part of the territory of the descendants of Joseph. And this is in Joshua 16. It mentions that it's part of the territory of the descendants of Joseph, that is Manasseh and Ephraim. Well, we already said earlier on today that it was between Ephraim and Benjamin, Benjamin being a very small tribe, Ephraim being a big tribe, because it wasn't bare mentioning that, I guess Manasseh was the next biggest tribe in the area. Okay. In Judges, we'll skip to Judges now, the descendants of Joseph, in Judges 1:22, it states specifically that the descendants of Joseph captured the city of Bethel, which again is said to previously be called Luz. Okay? In Joshua 4, remember Deborah, the prophetess, Deborah? Okay? She's said to dwell at Bethel under the palm tree of Deborah. I guess she had her own palm tree. But she's, definitely references Bethel, and probably a reference back to Genesis 35, okay? Where another Deborah, the nurse of, remember this story? The nurse of Jacob's mother, Rebekah, is said to have been buried under a tree at Bethel. So, she's buried under the tree is there, along comes another Deborah much later on in the game, in Joshua, which comes after Genesis, of course. It's said to be, she was to be found living near the tree of Deborah. Bethel is said in Judges 4 to be in Mount Ephraim. Okay, Mount Ephraim, named after the tribe of Ephraim. In Judges 20, where the Hebrew, now you've got to understand that different translations do different things. When the Hebrew was translated into the King James version, okay, in the Judges 20 verse 18, it's where the Hebrew Bethel is translated into the King James version as house of God. The people of Israel go to Bethel to ask counsel of God. And why? Well, they were planning to attack the Benjaminites at the Battle of Gibeah. Benjaminites? I thought they were Israelis, Jews. It's interesting, isn't it? Go read Judges 20, verse 18. And they make a second visit, kind of interesting. They go back there to ask counsel of God in Judges 20, 26, because they lost the battle. They lost the battle. Probably because they were trying to fight against people that God didn't want them to fight against. I don't know. Anyway, but the point I'm making is that Bethel was evidently an important religious settlement at the time of this time in the Israeli history, which is surprising that it no longer exists, because so many other cities and towns that were also prominent in Israeli history, in Jewish history, are still there, or at least the remains of them are, or we know where they were. Bethel is, for being such a very important place at this time, it's kind of odd that there's not much of it now. It was so important. It was so important that the Ark of the Covenant, remember the Ark of the Covenant? You're right, I'm sure you do. Was kept in Bethel under the care of Phineas, the grandson of Aaron. So we're way back in the early times, right? And that's in Judges 20. So regardless of what other towns they captured, this sort of thing, Bethel was considered to be that important to them that they kept the Ark of the Covenant there, which was, the greatest treasure that the Jews had at that time. In Judges 21, Bethel is said to be south of Shiloh. And I'm not going to ask them to put the map up again. I think you've seen it too many times. But if you start going south of here, east of there, west of there, you see what I'm saying? If you look south of Shiloh, thank you, Joyce, you can see that you can basically pinpoint where it is simply from the Bible references. Okay? And I said, what's interesting now is that the next mention of the ark, now, it was at Bethel, big center of religious things, but in 1 Samuel, in chapter 4 of 1 Samuel, it's said to be kept at Shiloh, just up the road. Okay? I mean, 1 Samuel in chapter 7 says that the prophet Samuel, who resided at Ramah, used to make a yearly circuit, okay, a yearly, just like a circuit judge would do, of Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah to judge Israel. So it was still pretty important, although for some reason or other they moved the ark to Shiloh. Perhaps Shiloh, we haven't got to that one yet, have we? But when we do, we'll probably find Shiloh was a more fortified city. I don't know, yet. We haven't got that far. I mean, in 1 Samuel 10, Samuel tells Saul, the future king, to go to Bethel to visit the hill of God. Okay, we've seen in the picture the hill. Because he's going to meet a group of prophets coming down from the high place, so presumably up on the hill at Bethel, with a psaltery and a tabret and a pipe and a harp. Now, that's very interesting, but it also appears that at the same time as it was an Israeli, Jewish religious place of meaning, and Saul and Samuel rather made circuits to it, and it's very important, there was a Philistine garrison there. Remember, the Philistines lived on the coast, and the Jews lived up in the hills. But the Philistines were, in fact, the conquering race at the time. More of that later. But despite the fact that it was a big center of Jewish religious interest, there was a Philistine garrison there. Bethel's mentioned again in 1 Samuel 13, 2 Samuel 30, after the kingdom of Israel was split into two kingdoms. On the death of Solomon, it was about 931 or something like that. Jeroboam, remember the story? Rehoboam inherits from from Solomon, and they go to where? Shechem, remember? They go to Shechem and have a big conference about, the new king, and he's crowned at Shechem, because by then Shechem was still the big chief place, if you will. And the northern tribes, all 10 of them, stated to Rehoboam that, Solomon had us working almost slave labor, and he took people for a year at a time to help build the temple. Didn't do the same to the tribes of Judah, because that was his tribe. We don't like it, so we'd like you to change things. And Rehoboam says, all right, and I'm paraphrasing the Bible, but Rehoboam then goes to his advisors, who are all young people, all from Judah, and says, what do you think? What should I do? And they say, hey, stick it to them. And in fact, that's exactly what it does. And what happens is that the northern tribes revolt. They draw a line in the sand between the two, between the territory of Judah and Benjamin and the rest, and say, okay, that's it, we're different. And Jeroboam now has a problem, because all the religious items are in Jerusalem. The temple, the Ark of the Covenant, all the rest of it. So what Jeroboam does is make 2 calves of gold, and if you read 2 Kings 12, it's all in there, okay? And sets one up in Bethel, okay, and the other up in Dan, the far north of the kingdom. Why? Well, it made it unnecessary for the people of Israel to have to go to Jerusalem to worship in a temple there. Makes perfectly good sense. You'd split from the country. You don't want all your people spending their hard-earned tourist dollars in Judah. You want them to spend them in Israel. So he puts the two places. And rather than have just one, he has two, so that people don't have to go so far to get to where they wanted to do. And my comment here, and I read it for somewhere, says, it seems that the action provoked the hostility of the Judeans, and I can't imagine why for one moment. Some people say, I mean, in 1 Kings 13, there's a lovely story about how a man from Judah visited the shrine at Bethel and prophesied that it would eventually be destroyed by Josiah. Okay? So we're coming in. In 2 Kings, the prophets Elijah and Elisha are said to have visited Bethel on a journey from Gilgal north to Jericho in the south, shortly before Elijah's death in the 9th century. So it's still an important place. And later, Elisha returns alone to Bethel, and that story where he's taunted by some young men, and he climbs up on some stairs there and curses them and says they're going to be killed by bears, and they were. I'm not sure what that is in relation to our Bethel, but perhaps mistreating a prophet in a holy town was considered, not a good idea. Now there's a big gap there between Jeroboam and Bethel when it's next mentioned in connection with the 10th king of Israel, which was Jehu in 842. And there we're going to have to leave it for tonight because we've run out of time. We'll pick this up next week. But keep your Bible handy and keep Kings open, because we're going to be in and out of there all the time. So for me, Tony Baxter, good night. God bless.